You don't look like a first-class passenger. This must be some kind of mistake. That's what flight attendant Mia Larson said, right in front of everyone, before Ryan Carter could even hand her his ticket. 16 words. That was all it took to expose everything this flight had buried just under the surface. She didn't scan his pass. She didn't check his name. She just looked at his skin, his calm posture, his navy suit, and decided, on sight, that he didn't belong. Before we go any further, I want to know, where are you watching from? Leave a comment and hit subscribe if you believe that dignity has no dress code, because the story behind this moment runs deeper than you think. Ryan Carter stood quietly in the narrow aisle of Horizon Flight 417, grounded on the tarmac at SeaTac. In his hand was a ticket, first class, seat 1A, booked under an alias, paid in full. In front of him sat a white couple, already settled in his seat. They sipped champagne. They didn't even look uncomfortable. Emily and Jacob Pierce. Ryan knew their type before they opened their mouths. And sure enough, when he politely asked about 1A, Emily turned to him with a practiced smile. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" she asked, voice like cold marble. Jacob didn't bother looking up. The cabin lights flickered above them, bad wiring, storm delay, overbooked flight. All of it made the air feel thicker. Ryan said nothing. Not yet. He just adjusted the gold watch on his wrist, the one his grandfather had left him the night he passed, the night Ryan graduated with his master's in aeronautics. "You're going to need that backbone more than that diploma," his grandfather had told him, gripping his hand in the hospital bed. And he was right, because years earlier, Ryan had stood in a different airport, 25 years old, hopeful, dressed in his best, and been told at the gate that his upgrade had been accidentally reassigned. A white businessman had arrived late and smiled at the gate agent. Ryan never forgot that smile. It haunted him through business school, through every boardroom where his ideas were too ambitious, through every meeting where he had to prove his worth twice over. That moment built him, not in spite of it, but because of it. And now, as CEO of Horizon Air, the very airline he'd once flown as a second-class passenger, Ryan had come full circle. But today wasn't about status. Today, he was here undercover, quietly investigating a string of Reddit complaints about racial bias in Horizon's boarding process. He drove himself to SeaTac in his old 2008 Toyota Camry. No security, no press, just the same man with the same wristwatch, and a quiet fire in his chest. That fire flared now, as Kennedy Walsh, the junior flight attendant, looked over her tablet and gave a hollow shrug. "I'm not seeing your name for seat 1A, she said, voice clipped. "You're probably standby." "I'm not," Ryan said calmly. "It's confirmed." But Kennedy stepped forward, subtly blocking his path. "Coach is just a few rows back. We'll help you get settled." He didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply pulled out his phone and started recording. From 2 rows behind, another camera lifted. James Sullivan, a journalist nearing retirement, already had his lens trained on the confrontation. And 1 row over, a man named David Grant stood up, former pilot, black, disqualified from flying after a random audit years ago. "He has a right to that seat," David said quietly. "And you know it." Mia rolled her eyes. "Sir, please don't escalate the situation." "No one's escalating," Ryan said, his tone even. "I'm just asking you to respect my ticket." He held it up. Clear, visible, seat 1A. But Emily Pierce laughed. "If you're really first class, why are you still standing here?" Then she turned to Mia. "Can we just get this resolved? I'd like another glass." And Mia obliged. She poured Emily champagne and handed Jacob a napkin. She never looked at Ryan again. "You can film all you want," Kennedy said stiffly, "but you're blocking the aisle. I need you to move. I'm not moving until you do your job. Ryan answered. His voice was quiet, controlled, but inside. That memory at 25 screamed at him. The gate, the suit, the shame, and the way no one had stood for him then. But someone was standing now. David stepped forward. You see that man's watch? He said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear. That's a gold Elgin, worn by Tuskegee pilots, worn by men who paved the skies so the rest of us could sit here free. James's phone pinged. His video was already being shared. A travel influencer had picked it up. The flight hadn't even left the ground, and the moment was already flying. You sure you want this going viral? James asked Mia. She hesitated. Just for a second. And in that second, Ryan took 1 step forward. Not aggressive, not loud, but firm. That seat is mine, he said. And if you won't honor it, the internet will... The cabin quieted. A few more phones lifted. Emily fidgeted with her pearl bracelet. Kennedy's face flushed. Mia looked at the blinking light overhead, still flickering like a faulty signal, and for a moment, it looked like she might fold, but she didn't. If you don't comply, she said, voice sharp again, we'll have to call airport security. And Ryan smiled, just barely, because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man they were trying to remove signed all their checks. At 2:01 p.m., with the storm still delaying departure and the cabin heavy with murmurs. Mia Larson pointed toward the rear of the plane and said it again, this time louder. Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Coach is back there. Take your seat now, or we'll have you removed. The audacity wasn't just in her tone. It was in her complete dismissal of everything Ryan Carter represented, in front of the other passengers. She tried to humiliate him into silence, but Ryan didn't move. His feet stayed planted next to seat 1A, his phone still recording, behind him. Cameras were quietly lifting. At least 4 phones were pointed toward the front of the cabin now. And next to row 2, James Sullivan was still filming steadily, the little red light blinking like a heartbeat. This is absurd, Emily Pierce said, pulling her blanket higher. I paid for this seat, and now I'm being harassed? Her voice dripped with mock offense. Kennedy Walsh, the junior flight attendant, hesitated. Her fingers trembled just slightly over her tablet. Ryan caught the movement. She was unsure. She wasn't like Mia, cold and polished. Kennedy looked scared. Just run the system again, Ryan said calmly. My confirmation is there. I booked this weeks ago. Kennedy opened her mouth but didn't respond. She tapped the screen nervously. Behind her, William Hayes, the 3rd flight attendant. Quiet, barely noticed, watched with tight lips. He hadn't spoken yet, but his gaze lingered on Ryan longer than the others. Ryan saw the internal war playing out in William's expression. He recognized it. He had lived it. Years ago. He was just 30, freshly promoted to VP of Strategy at his previous firm. One of the youngest in the company's history. That same week, he had boarded a flight to Denver for a corporate summit. He wore his best suit, new cufflinks, polished shoes, at the gate. The attendant scanned his first-class ticket, looked at him for a second too long, then asked if he was traveling for someone else. He smiled politely and said, no. She nodded and let him through, but when he got to his seat, 2A, a white executive was already there, feet up, drink in hand. You sure this is your seat? The man had asked, smiling. Then he called the attendant over and said, there's been a mix-up. She didn't argue. She just asked Ryan to wait in the galley while they sorted it out. 20 minutes later, the door was closed, the flight took off, and Ryan was still standing, reassigned to a jump seat. No apology, no explanation. That memory had burned into him. Not because of the seat, but because of the quiet message it sent. Your money might get you this far, but not your presence, not your face. That flight became a turning point. It was the moment he stopped trying to be liked and started building something of his own. He never told anyone what happened that day, not even Camilla, his assistant, who had been with him from the start. But he remembered every word, every silence. And now, 15 years later, the scene was repeating. Only this time, he had power and a platform. Your name still isn't showing, Kennedy said nervously. But that might be a system delay. Mia stepped in sharply. There's no delay. The seat was open. The Pierces were on the standby upgrade list, and we reassigned it. End of story. But Ryan knew that wasn't true. He had booked this flight under an alternate name, as part of a quiet investigation into Horizon's own internal practices. Ever since the Reddit thread blew up 2 weeks ago, accusing the airline of randomly reassigning seats held by black and brown passengers, Ryan had been reviewing internal data, quietly collecting stories, and even running anonymous surveys. This flight? It was the final test. And now, the test had gone live. Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a monogrammed checkbook. Yes, a physical checkbook, and held it in her lap like a badge. I don't see what the issue is, she muttered, mostly to herself. Money solves these things. Jacob nodded in silent agreement. Ryan glanced at James. The journalist mouthed. Still live. Mia folded her arms. Sir, I'm calling airport security. Please do, Ryan replied evenly. But first, I need you to confirm something for the camera. Are you denying me access to the seat listed on this confirmed first-class ticket? He held it out. Steady hand. Bold black letters. Seat 1A. Kennedy's voice caught. She glanced at Mia, then back at the screen. I think there might be a booking error. There's no error, said David Grant, rising again from row 3. You're making one. Kennedy blushed. Her hand slipped. The tablet beeped. A hidden screen loaded. An internal log. David leaned in and saw it. Ryan Carter. 1A, confirmed. Flagged. Why's it flagged? David asked. Why's his name yellow? Kennedy didn't answer. James zoomed in on the screen. You might want to stop filming, Mia snapped. That's confidential. So was his seat, David said, louder now. And you gave it away. The murmurs grew louder. A man in 5A asked if they were going to miss their connection. A woman 2 rows back whispered, Did she really take money? Ryan spoke again, slow and deliberate. One more time. I paid for this seat. You gave it away. I want to know why. Mia was breathing heavier now. She hadn't expected resistance. Not like this. Not in front of witnesses. It's above my pay grade, she said, backing toward the galley, but Ryan's phone stayed trained on her. Then let's take it to someone who's paid more. He tapped the screen. Camilla, he said quietly. His assistant picked up instantly. Go ahead, she said. It's happening. Ryan murmured. Start the clock. Push out the clips. Understood, she replied. You want media alerts first, or legal? Both, Ryan said. Then he looked at Mia and Kennedy, who had frozen near the beverage cart. You'll want to stand by, he added, because this isn't just a seat anymore. It's a statement. He hung up. David's eyes met his, and in that glance, between 2 black men who had flown too many miles, been questioned too many times, and swallowed too much silence, there was no need to speak. The cabin lights flickered again, but this time, Ryan didn't blink. At 2:02 p.m., the air inside the cabin felt tighter than the grounded aircraft itself, as if everyone could sense something irreversible building between rows 1 and 3. Mia Larson's voice carried over the tense hush like a blade, sharp and unbending. "Security has been notified," she declared. Chin raised, still refusing to acknowledge the confirmation code printed clearly on Ryan Carter's ticket. "We'll be escorting him off the plane." But no one moved. Kennedy Walsh stood frozen beside her, eyes darting between the blinking manifest screen and the murmuring passengers. David Grant remained standing by row 3, arms crossed over his chest, as if his mere presence was a shield. And James Sullivan kept his phone recording steadily from seat 2D, his journalistic instincts burning behind his calm exterior. Ryan remained silent, expression unreadable, as he tightened the worn leather strap of his grandfather's watch, its gold catching the flickering cabin light like a quiet defiance. For a moment, the scene around him blurred, his mind pulled backward to a day that had never really left him. It was 14 years ago, a humid afternoon in Dallas, and Ryan, then just 28, was standing outside the corporate tower of Brantford Jet Leasing, waiting for an elevator that never seemed to come. He had just presented a fleet optimization proposal to the board, meticulous, cost-effective, and future-facing. But after the meeting, a partner had clapped him on the back and said with a smirk, "You're sharper than you look, Ryan." That surprised me. The room had laughed, thinking it was harmless. But Ryan hadn't forgotten. Later that week, on his return flight, his first-class ticket mysteriously disappeared from the system. When he questioned the gate agent, she glanced at his ID, then said, "There must have been a technical reset. Let me check with my supervisor." 10 minutes passed, then 20. While Ryan waited, sweating under the Texas sun, a white colleague from the same meeting strolled past him into boarding with a last-minute upgrade when Ryan was finally allowed to board. His seat had been reassigned to a priority customer. They offered him coach with a smile. He accepted it, quietly. And as he sat near the rear of the plane, knees pressed against the seat in front of him, he made a vow that shaped every decision since. "I'll build something they can't take away." And he did. But the wound never really healed. That moment had hollowed out a piece of him, one he never shared. Not even with Camilla. Not even on the night Horizon posted its first billion-dollar quarter. It was the same hollow space that now, standing inside a cabin supposedly run by his own airline, felt like it was being reopened. Emily Pierce's laugh cut through the silence like fingernails across glass. "All this drama over a seat? I thought first-class passengers knew how to behave." She sipped her drink slowly, savoring the power she thought she held. Jacob Pierce smirked beside her, still flipping casually through a digital newspaper as if the man whose seat he had stolen was a mere nuisance. Ryan turned slightly toward the other passengers, aware now that nearly every phone in the cabin was aimed at him or the front row. "You're watching this in real time," he said softly, voice calm but resolute. "You see the ticket, you see the seat, you see the reaction." He turned back to Mia. "Now ask yourself, if I looked different, would we still be standing here?" Mia's jaw tightened. "Sir, I've already told you." "Yes," Ryan interrupted, for the first time cutting her off. "And you're going to keep saying it, no matter how much evidence is in front of you. But the truth is written across this entire cabin. You didn't just take my seat. You took my dignity and assumed no one would notice." He held up his phone. "But they are..." Behind him, Grace Nguyen, silent until now, stood at the galley curtain, visibly distressed. Her hands shook as she glanced at the manifest screen, then at Ryan, then at Mia. "He's listed," she whispered, voice barely audible. "Seat 1A, it says confirmed." Mia turned, her voice low and angry. "This doesn't concern you. Grace, stay in your lane." But it was too late. James had caught the moment on video. The other passengers heard it too. Grace flinched but didn't retreat. "I'm just saying what's on the screen," she said. louder this time. Kennedy stepped back, suddenly pale, her voice cracking. I didn't realize it earlier. The sync error must have refreshed. But he's there. Ryan didn't speak. He let them fumble. Let the moment hang, James muttered. You don't need a press conference when the facts scream for themselves. And then came the next crack in Mia's polished facade. A passenger's smartwatch dinged. An airdrop notification. Someone had shared a photo on the tiny screen. Mia's hand could be seen discreetly accepting a folded bill from Emily Pierce just before boarding. A $600 bribe. Captured. Time-stamped. Undeniable. The passenger who sent it stood and pointed. I didn't want to get involved, but I saw it happen. She took the money. Then they got seated in 1A and 1B. The ripple through the cabin became a wave. Gasps. Phones rising higher. Passengers shifting in their seats. No longer passive observers. Emily turned crimson. This is outrageous, she yelled. We're being attacked. No, Ryan said simply. You're being seen. Kennedy backed away from the screen entirely, mumbling something about not wanting to be involved. But it was too late for that. William Hayes finally stepped forward, clearing his throat. This isn't right, and everyone here knows it. Mia stared at him, then at Ryan, and for the first time, her confidence cracked. Not because of the evidence, but because the tide in the cabin had turned. The power she thought she had was slipping away. And Ryan? He still hadn't raised his voice. He still hadn't said who he really was. But the story unfolding was bigger than one man's silence. It was about every flight where someone had been shifted, ignored, or erased, and told to smile through it. The lights above flickered again. Storm still grounded, cabin still sealed. But the real turbulence had already begun. At 2:03 p.m., the cabin of Horizon Flight 417 had become a courtroom, and every passenger was a silent witness, jury, and potential broadcaster. Mia Larson stood rigid near the galley, cheeks flushed, jaw locked, but her authority was slipping by the second. Across the aisle, Kennedy Walsh had withdrawn completely, arms folded, retreating behind the beverage cart like a student caught cheating, and Emily Pierce, whose smug expression had carried her through the first half of the standoff, now looked rattled as whispers filled the cabin. Jacob, for the first time, put down his newspaper, as if realizing the room was no longer on his side. But Ryan Carter didn't gloat. He didn't taunt. He simply stood in the aisle, tickets still in hand, as if anchored by something deeper than status. The bribe photo had hit the passengers like lightning, and Grace Nguyen's trembling confirmation of Ryan's name on the manifest had begun to tilt the cabin's moral axis. Still, Mia doubled down. "We have protocols," she barked, "and he's disrupting the flight." But her voice cracked, just slightly, when she said it. And Ryan, calm, unmoved, just turned to face the row behind him. "If asking for what you paid for is a disruption," he said, "then maybe the protocol's broken." That line, quiet but clear, settled over the passengers like truth hitting oxygen. Cameras didn't shake, eyes didn't blink, and somewhere behind him, a child whispered to his mother, "What did he do wrong?" But the child already knew. Ryan exhaled slowly and closed his eyes for just a second. And in that second, a memory returned uninvited. He was 35, standing in the front row of a luxury conference in London. Just after speaking on equity and corporate leadership, the room had erupted with applause. He'd stepped off stage, smiling, when a man in a tuxedo intercepted him in the VIP lounge. "Sorry, sir," the man had said, glancing at Ryan's badge. "That section's for speakers only." "I just came from the stage," Ryan had replied, puzzled. "No offense," the man had muttered. But you don't look like the others. Ryan had felt it again, that sudden dislocation, like the ground slipping under him. His company's logo was on the banner outside. He had just delivered the closing keynote. And still, to someone, he was out of place. That night. He could have gone to the press. He could have posted the man's name. But he didn't. He walked to his hotel in silence and made a quiet vow. The next time the world tried to erase him, it would be televised. And here, now, in front of dozens of passengers with phones pointed straight at him, it was, "Do you want to sit, sir?" Grace asked gently from the back of the cabin. Breaking the moment, her voice trembled, but it wasn't fear. It was conviction. "Your seat is still available." Mia turned sharply toward her. "You don't have the authority to." "And neither do you anymore," Grace cut in, surprising even herself. Kennedy looked away. Mia stepped forward as if to reassert control, but David Grant, still standing, shifted one step into her path. It wasn't threatening. It was symbolic. Ryan caught the move, nodded once, then walked forward toward seat 1A, slow and steady. As the cabin watched in silence, he placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, sat down, and buckled his belt. The seat was warm. Emily had just vacated it, flustered and furious, muttering under her breath about lawsuits. Jacob followed her reluctantly, red-faced and silent. Ryan didn't look at them as they left. He looked up at the flickering light above his seat, now blinking again like a broken heartbeat. Then he glanced at his phone. The screen was still recording. "Camilla," he said softly into his mic. "We're in position." "Understood," she replied. "Local media's already seen the clips. They're asking for comment." "Give them a statement," Ryan said. "But not from PR. From me." He set the phone down on his tray table, then folded his hands and looked out the window at the gray sky. Mia hadn't moved. Her face had gone pale. The buzz in the cabin had grown quiet now, still tense, but no longer confused. The truth was too loud to ignore. "You're going to regret this," Mia said at last, but her voice was hoarse, the words empty. "You should have just taken the other seat." Ryan didn't respond immediately. He looked at her like someone studying a machine that had malfunctioned. And then he answered, quietly but with weight. "And let you keep doing this to the next person?" James Sullivan, filming from the side, zoomed in, not for drama, but for history. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a reckoning. Ryan didn't just reclaim his seat. He reclaimed his presence, his right to exist without apology, his right to be seen as he was, a man who'd built an empire from scratch, while still being told, again and again, that he didn't belong in the very places he had created. But today, no one could erase him, not without the world watching, and the world, now, was wide awake. At 2:04 p.m., the moment that would be replayed in headlines, hashtags, and HR manuals for years to come finally arrived. The cabin had gone still, like the eye of a storm, the kind of quiet that settles when people know the old rules no longer apply. Ryan Carter sat in seat 1A, calm, composed, hands folded over the gold watch that had witnessed too many quiet humiliations to count. The light above him flickered once, then steadied, as if even the aircraft itself knew it was time for correction. Mia Larson stood 2 steps away, still trying to recover her voice, still clutching onto scraps of power that had long since slipped from her fingers. Kennedy Walsh lingered at the back, visibly shaken, her mouth opening and closing like someone trying to breathe underwater. And Grace Nguyen stood frozen, not with fear now, but anticipation. Across from them, James Sullivan was still filming. He hadn't stopped. Neither had the passengers. And then, Ryan reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a slim black card, the kind that didn't advertise wealth but whispered authority. "This," he said quietly, holding it up, "is who I am." Mia blinked. Kennedy took a step closer, squinting. The card bore no airline miles, no elite status badge, just a name. One name. Ryan Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Horizon Air. Mia's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her throat locked. The color drained from her face. Kennedy staggered back a step, her hand covering her mouth. Grace gasped quietly. David Grant nodded once, knowingly, like a man who had seen 100 fights end with the truth. Not fists. Emily Pierce. Halfway down the aisle, with Jacob trailing behind her, spun around. "Wait, he's the CEO?" Her voice cracked like a windshield hit by stone. Jacob muttered, "Oh no," and didn't turn around. Ryan stood, the calm in his voice now anchored with iron. "Mia Larson," he said, facing her directly. "You are terminated, effective immediately, for accepting a bribe, attempting to falsify flight records, and for engaging in discriminatory behavior unbecoming of Horizon Air." He paused. "You're done." A collective gasp swept the cabin. Mia's hands trembled. You can't fire me on the spot. I'm union protected. I'll have legal representation." "You're entitled to both," Ryan replied. "And we'll provide documentation of your actions to your union rep, the FAA, and legal counsel. But you're no longer a Horizon employee as of this moment." He turned to Kennedy. "Kennedy Walsh, you are suspended. Pending internal review, you bypassed protocol, mishandled the manifest, and participated in a coordinated violation of passenger rights." Kennedy choked on a breath. "Please, I didn't know who you were." "That's the problem," Ryan said sharply. Not cruel, but clear. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect." His voice wasn't raised. It didn't have to be. The truth filled the room louder than shouting ever could. He turned then to Grace, whose hands were still clenched at her sides. "Grace Nguyen," he said, and her eyes snapped to his, wide and startled. "You're promoted, effective immediately. You're now our interim lead flight attendant for this aircraft, and I want you to report directly to our cabin service reform team starting tomorrow. Your integrity matters. You chose truth when it wasn't safe. I see that. So does everyone else." Grace's lips trembled. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, not out of fear, but gratitude. And then Ryan turned his gaze toward Emily and Jacob Pierce, who stood paralyzed near the emergency exit door, their faux confidence finally punctured. "As for the Pierces," he said, raising his phone, "your bribe has been documented, your comments recorded, and your names will be added to Horizon's no-fly list indefinitely." Emily stammered. "You can't. You don't have the right." "I do," Ryan interrupted. "And I will." Jacob tried to argue, but his voice cracked under the weight of silence. They both turned and fled the cabin, pushed not by security, but by shame. David Grant exhaled slowly. James lowered his phone for the first time in nearly 10 minutes. "That just happened," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But Ryan wasn't finished. He picked up his phone again and tapped the screen. "Camila," he said. "It's done. Terminations are in motion. I want HR looped in. Begin drafting public statements and notify internal comms. No vague language. Say exactly what happened." "Understood," Camilla replied crisply. "Also, James Sullivan," Ryan said, nodding toward the journalist, "deserves priority access to our press call. He was here. He captured the truth. Let's honor that." James blinked, stunned. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you," Ryan replied, "for not putting the camera down at that." He sat back down in 1A, the very seat they tried to strip from him, and adjusted the gold watch that had survived boardrooms. Bias. and broken systems. It gleamed under the now steady light. Ryan looked around the cabin. No one spoke. No one argued. They just watched, silent, reverent, as the man they dismissed 5 minutes earlier reclaimed not only his seat, but the entire narrative. At 2:05 p.m., with the cabin still grounded by the storm outside, the real turbulence now came from inside, through whispered disbelief, quiet nods of vindication, and the blinding clarity of truth delivered in front of witnesses. Mia Larson had been escorted out, not by security, but by the weight of her own unraveling authority. Kennedy Walsh, suspended, sat near the rear in silence, head bowed, too shaken to process the fallout. Grace Nguyen, barely steady, now wore a new badge on her uniform, interim lead, and stood tall with quiet dignity. The kind forged not by ambition, but by choosing to speak when others stayed silent. Ryan Carter remained in seat 1A, his hands folded, eyes forward, but his phone pressed to his ear as he issued commands that would ripple far beyond this flight. "Camila," he said evenly, "prepare an internal bulletin. Subject line, Immediate Accountability Action Plan, Launch Unity Skies, now." The woman on the other end, his longtime assistant and now head of external affairs, didn't hesitate. "Drafting it. Do you want media follow-up embedded or separate?" "Separate," Ryan said. "No slogans, just truth. Use plain language. What happened, what we're changing, and how fast." "Understood. And press is calling back-to-back. 3 national outlets, and the local morning news. I'll take one at the gate. Give them a quote they can't twist. Respect isn't earned by status, it's lost in silence." Passengers around him weren't fidgeting anymore. They were still, reverent, processing what they had just seen. Not a scandal, not a viral outrage, a correction, an overdue one. James Sullivan, camera resting on his lap now, stared out the window, then back at Ryan. "You could have let the system handle it, quietly, behind the curtain." Ryan didn't look away. "That's the problem. Too much silence, too many curtains." And then, softly, he added, "And I've lived on both sides of them." David Grant leaned slightly across the aisle, voice low but steady. "Whatever happens next, you gave us a moment we've waited years for." Ryan nodded. "This moment wasn't about me. It's about making sure there's not another one." Camilla's voice returned in his ear. "Board just saw the internal alert. Mixed reactions. Legal wants to slow the rollout. Union clause implications." Ryan replied without flinching. "They can slow paperwork, but they can't slow principle. Unity Skies launches now. Every crew member will undergo recertification, not just training modules. Interactive accountability reviews, empathy led by lived experience facilitators. Every complaint logged, reviewed, answered. No more silence." Camilla paused. "Then it begins today." Ryan exhaled once, slowly. "No more waiting." Across the cabin, a middle-aged woman with silver hair reached out and touched Grace's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "For standing up." Grace smiled faintly, still overwhelmed, but nodded. William Hayes, the previously silent attendant, stepped out from behind the curtain and stood beside her. "If there's a new standard," he said, looking at Ryan, "I'd like to be held to it." Ryan nodded slowly. "Then stand in it. Starting now." The cabin door remained closed, but the world beyond had already entered through the phones in everyone's hands. James opened a trending feed. Clips from the incident already had over 2 million views. Ryan's words, Mia's refusal, Emily's bribe, the CEO card, the firings, all captured, all verified. A trending hashtag had formed on its own, hashtag Seat1A. Ryan didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply spoke the words into his phone that would shape the company's future. "Tell our social team to stay quiet. No spin. Let the story stand. We'll speak through actions, not applause." Then he added, almost as if to himself, "This company was built to move people. That includes the ones it tried to ignore." A few rows back, a teenage boy leaned into his mother and whispered. He didn't yell. He just fixed it. The mother smiled gently. That's what real power sounds like. Ryan glanced at the overhead light. It wasn't flickering anymore. Not above seat 1A. Not today. And as the first-class cabin began to exhale, Ryan Carter stared out the window, not at the runway, but at the reflection of his own face, calm, certain, unshaken. His legacy had just shifted, not by expansion, not by acquisition, but by truth, spoken in plain view, on a grounded flight where silence used to win. Not anymore. At 2:06 p.m., as the flight crew prepared to resume pre-takeoff checks and the storm outside began to shift eastward, the cabin inside Horizon Flight 417 was already transformed, not by turbulence, not by delay, but by clarity. The truth had surfaced, unfiltered, in full view of everyone on board, and the man they dismissed as just another passenger had rewritten the flight's narrative without shouting, without threatening, without moving a single step beyond his assigned seat. Ryan Carter remained seated in 1A, his tray table still down, phone now idle, eyes resting on the patch of sky emerging between rain clouds. Camilla's voice returned in his ear. "Internal communications complete. The Unity Skies protocol is live. We've already received over 80 messages from staff who say they've waited years for this." Ryan nodded slowly. "We don't lead by perfection. We lead by repair." "Legal pushed back again," Camilla added, her voice cautious. "I told them you're not interested in optics, just truth. That's why you're still here," he said quietly. Around him, the cabin had settled into something different than silence. It was reflection. Mia was gone. Kennedy, still present, now sat near the galley, facing forward but visibly hollowed, suspended, but not beyond redemption. Grace moved gently through the aisle, guiding pre-departure checks with poise not born from title, but from trust. William shadowed her steps, quietly offering to learn from her example. David Grant, now back in his seat, adjusted his tie and exhaled. A long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. James Sullivan had already begun typing, but his hands moved slowly, for once. The headline would write itself, and somewhere behind them all, a child asked their parent, "Will it always be like this now?" The mother answered with hope in her voice. "Maybe, if people like him keep showing up." Ryan adjusted his seatbelt as the cabin door finally closed. But even as the plane readied to taxi, his mind returned to a promise he made long ago. He was 24, walking out of a second interview at a small regional airline that never called him back. The VP at the time had shaken his hand with a smile and said, "You're impressive, but we're looking for someone who fits the culture." Ryan had smiled, nodded, and walked to the parking lot without responding. That night, sitting on the hood of his car under streetlight glow, he made himself a vow, not just to get into aviation, not just to rise, but to build a culture he wouldn't have to fit into, one that would grow around truth, around fairness, around people who were told they didn't belong. And now, seated in the most visible spot on a plane that nearly erased him, that vow felt whole. Ryan turned to James, who was now packing away his gear. "Tell it straight," he said. "Don't soften it." "Wasn't planning to," James replied. "But for what it's worth, this wasn't just a correction, it was a blueprint." Ryan gave the faintest smile. Then let's make sure it gets built. As the plane pushed back from the gate, a buzz sounded on Ryan's phone, a notification from the comms team. Another airline had just issued a statement committing to review their DEI protocols. Citing Horizon's announcement as a catalyst, the ripple had already begun. Another message followed, this one from a rival CEO. Respect, rare to see it handled this directly. We'll be reevaluating our own systems this week. Thank you. Ryan stared at the words for a long moment, then locked his phone and placed it face down. He didn't need applause. What he needed, what the industry needed, was movement. Consistent, humble, uncomfortable movement. Seat 1A had become more than a number. It had become a symbol. And not because it belonged to someone powerful, but because power chose not to walk away. In the end. That was the lesson. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about presence, about saying, I'm staying right here, even when the world nudges you toward the exit. As the aircraft turned toward the runway, the clouds began to part, just slightly, letting in a stream of light across the aisle. Grace looked up from her checklist and caught Ryan's gaze. He didn't say a word. He just gave a small nod, and she returned it. That was all. The unity didn't need a speech. It had already landed. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe. Quiet courage like this deserves to be remembered.